Welcome to Digital Democracy on Tap. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Energy is the pulse of our day-to-day life. The ways that we create it and use it are changing, but one thing is certain, we rely on it and will continue to for a very, very long time. We'll talk about how our energy future might look while looking at what we have in place today. Several bills related to energy went before the Kansas Statehouse this session. Some bills passed, some did not. We'll discuss the ramifications of it over the next hour, but first, let's meet our panel. Ashok Gupta is Senior Energy Economist of the Natural Resources Defense Council. Brett Leopold is President of ITC Great Plains. Mike Ross is Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Relations at the Southwest Power Pool. Republican State Representative Mark Schreiber from Emporia is the Vice Chair of the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee in the Kansas Legislature. And we have Brian Grimmett, the Energy and Environment reporter for KMUW and the Kansas News Service. We want you to join the conversation too. You can ask questions of our panel through the Facebook comments, or you can email us right now. That address is info@kmuw.org. I want to start off discussing some recent legislation. One of the many bills that passed during the Kansas Legislature last month was the securitization bill. Brian, can you briefly define securitization and what this bill really means for people?
Yeah, I can try. So securitization is a really complicated kind of financial tool here. So I'm going to give kind of the third grade level answer because that's how I best understand it as well. But what it is, like I said, it's a financial tool. What it allows a utility to refinance some of its debt, basically what it still owes on, say, a coal plant. So it's still paying on it. It can refinance that at a much lower interest rate than basically what it's on the hook for at the current moment. And that's because this new loan, this new bond is backed directly by ratepayers rather than the company. And that sounds kind of subtle, but it makes a big difference. And it really kind of helps them with that financing it. And so when you get that lower interest rate, it allows them to save money. And with that saved money, they can reinvest potentially in new infrastructure, maybe, renewable energy or number of other different things. But, simply it's a financial tool that kind of lets them refinance some of their debt.
Are those other pieces defined? Like maybe they could invest in green energy? Is that part of the deal, or is it just that, now there are options?
Now there are options. So there in the bill itself, there was no specificity, and this was part of the negotiations as well. There's no requirement what they do or that they even use this tool at all. It simply makes it available to utility companies to be able to use it. Some environmental groups, not all, but some environmental groups were a little frustrated by that. They wanted to put some limits on it and to say, hey, you need to, if you use this, then it has to be used for, reinvestment in renewable energy. But that is not a requirement of this bill. But it does, like I said, give them this access to this, and they're going to use it. They haven't committed to using it, but they'd not be smart. It wouldn't be smart to not use it, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. What other ramifications of closing down coal plants would there be, like jobs? I mean, how far out are they looking? Be impacted?
Yeah. So Evergy, which is the state's largest electric utility company, and they're not the only ones who have coal plants in the state, but they're the largest. They actually just recently announced that they plan on closing most, if not all, of their coal plants by 2040. The earliest would be in Lawrence in a couple of years from, I think, 2023 or 2024. But they have kind of over the next 10 years a plan to do that. And what happens with that is a big kind of question. There are people who work at these plants. There are ancillary jobs connected to it, whether that's in transportation, for getting the coal there and so on and so on. And then there's property tax issues that you have to think about as well. What do these counties do when, this plant that's there is no longer there, and some of those complicated questions. And there aren't, set answers to any of those questions at this point. It's we need to start thinking about that too, kind of space.
Thank you, Brian. Representative Schreiber, you introduced a bill that would have created a task force that would then create an energy plan for the state. Can you describe the bill for us?
Sure. The bill I started on last summer and fall, and I used the state of Iowa's energy plan as a template. And basically, what their guiding principles on their plan were economic development for the state through use of different energy resources, encouraging energy development within the state. And so I took that concept and applied it to Kansas. And the bill basically outlines the members of the proposed task force, energy plan task force. It included, utilities, both on the electric and natural gas side, renewable advocates, and oil and gas representatives. So I tried to make it as broad as possible because we'll need all sorts of energy, now and in the future. So I wanted it as broad as possible. And then the goal of the task force was then to create a plan for the state to guide its policies, maybe future statutes and so forth, but not do it through a mandate centric kind of way. It was more develop this through a consensus building process and then implement it as we needed to, either through the legislative or regulatory process.
So that was the hope for this bill. What happened with it?
Well, we had a hearing in the House committee that I'm vice chair of, and we had a lot of proponents for it. We had a couple of opponents, some discussion about it, but I think in the end, even though it passed out of the committee, it didn't make it above the line in the House before turnaround in early March. And I think a lot of it was driven by comments made during the House hearing that maybe this was just an attempt to implement a Green New Deal type of process in the state. And I think that scared some people, rightly or wrongly, and just didn't gain any momentum after it came out of committee. But I'm still committed to work towards that task force because I think an energy plan is necessary as new advancements come along and so forth. They're going to happen regardless of whether we have a plan. But I think if the state has a plan, we can better utilize those new technologies or whatever might be coming down the pike towards us.
Do you think this is the kind of thing that, next time around, if you reintroduce this or however you do that, that if you just kind of better inform people or communicate more, that it will have the support that it would need?
I think so. I think it's just a matter of continual communication. This isn't some subterfuge to get in some new mandates or whatever into the state. It's really, at least my intent, is to be prepared as these technologies come forward. And one of the ones I used in the committee hearing was on electric vehicles. I think there are a number of issues surrounding the expansion of electric vehicle use throughout the state and the country that the state needs to pay attention to, whether it's how are we going to fund the state highway plan if gas taxes drop off, how do we compensate that for if there are more electric vehicles. And that's just a very small item that we would have to look at, but there are a number of issues that I would like the state to be prepared for as these technologies come to the forefront.
Thank you.
Sarah Jane, just to add something real quick to that, as we look at kind of, and I think Representative Schreiber, it's interesting that he, looking to these other states, because we are surrounded by other states that also have some of the same wind and solar resources we have, and it will be competitive. And like Representative Schreiber said, as I talk to other experts around the country, this kind of transition from fossil fuels to more renewable energy is happening, and the technology is picking up. And one of the worries and concerns is that if there isn't some kind of plan, if there isn't some side of forethought, then Kansas might get left behind is probably overstating it a bit, but at least not be as competitive as Nebraska, as Missouri, as Iowa, when developers go looking to site some of these projects.
And if I could add one other thought, when I was presenting in the House committee, one of the things that just happened to coincide with the committee hearing was Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, sent a letter to business CEOs, basically saying, if you're not preparing your company, your investors for the coming transition to new technologies and so forth in the energy industry, then you're not doing your responsibility as captain of your industries or your companies. And that, his message was, you need to prepare now. These things are coming and you need to prepare now, not only just because it might be good for climate or rates or whatever it might be, but it's also going to be good for your investors and your employees. So I think that was a strong message in my mind from a leader in the business industry about why there is a need to prepare.
I want to come to Ashok next. Kansas is one of only a few states without an energy plan. How are other states benefiting from some of this forethought?
I think both Representative Schreiber and Brian talked about it. I mean, basically, Kansas has a huge competitive advantage when it comes to renewable resources. We've developed a lot of wind, but we could also be developing a lot of solar. We need to do the transmission, the storage, the hydrogen. There's so much emerging in this new energy space, and Kansas just needs to get organized to benefit from it. So all Kansans can benefit from having a direction and a vision and get coordinated and organized. It shouldn't have to be about, is it just about climate, or is it just about rates, or is it just about the economy? Energy touches everything. The agriculture sector, industrial sector, bringing good companies here, retaining companies. People are very interested. Energy touches everything, right? So if we don't have an energy plan, we're basically going blind in terms of what we want to do in terms of our priorities to attract companies and educate our workforce and take advantage of all the assets that we have. So Kansas has a lot of assets, a lot of resources, and we should be leading the charge and not be followers here. And we can come out real winners. And so I think the plan is really about how Kansans want to lead and be out front in terms of growing their economy, keeping young people in the state, dealing with some of the rural challenges that we have. And so I think there's a real opportunity right now. I think the plan is part of it. Even absent the plan, we still have to do lots of things. I mean, the legislature did ask for a study on the cost issues, and London Economics and AECOM. There have been other plans and studies. So we'll be doing things in different pieces in the meantime, but hopefully the legislature can get agreement and can have a large enough table to bring in a lot of different voices to kind of align these issues and be ready. And like I said, some of it we can't wait for, right? So if there are federal dollars coming for transmission and storage and broadband in the coming 4 to 6 months, we need to be ready for that. We're going to have to do it absent a plan, but it'd be nice to have a plan. So to me, we're going to be doing things even without a plan, but at some point, the sooner we can have a plan, the better. The plan will take time to do as well. But my view, the other view is really we can't wait as well. So Evergy does their plan. We need to have the munis and co-ops start looking at what they are going to do to manage the transition. Securitization doesn't apply to them. Should it? Can we come up with a different finance tool to help munis and co-ops manage their transition? How are we going to deal with transmission issues? And we're going to hear about that, I'm sure, more later in terms of the cost allocation and those issues, storage and batteries and hydrogen and electric vehicles. I mean, buildings are a huge part of where we use our energy. what's happening on energy efficiency in buildings. I mean, there's a lot of issues that these, questions we all work on every day. And like I said, I would love a plan. I'd love it sooner rather than later. But I also know, as a energy policy advocate, we also can't be waiting either. We're going to be doing lots of things and have to keep doing them while we hopefully can get a plan moving forward.
Building the aircraft while flying it a little bit. Thank you. Mike, I want to ask you now, where does Kansas stand in the realm of energy as a whole? What kind of energy does Kansas depend on right now?
Well, that's a very good question, Sarah Jane, and thank you for the opportunity inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion today. Probably would make sense for me to, before I answer that, to point out that Southwest Power Pool, we're one of 7 Federal Energy Regulatory Commission designated regional transmission organizations in the United States. And so with the other 6, we run the electric grid, the wholesale electric market, and planned transmission for all our, for 2/3 of the country. We're all not-for-profits. And so, and within the SPP region, we are the reliability coordinator. Think air traffic controllers. So we don't own the 70,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. We don't own the 800 plus generators, everything from coal and gas to nuclear and wind and solar. Our members do. In fact, ITC, and Brett there, is a member of SPP. We have 104 members across all or part of 14 states, including the utilities, the load serving entities, if you will, there in Kansas. So that just kind of tells you a little bit about who we are, what we do, in terms of ensuring reliability and the lowest cost electricity. So because we facilitate,
you're telling them these different aircrafts energy, like when to stop and go, which ones go now and which ones go later.
Exactly. We're forecasting how much power is needed a day ahead and in real time. And then in terms of, and then making sure the generation is there to match it. And all of this is happening at nearly the speed of light across 70,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. And which of those 800 generators provide the power that's needed in day ahead or in 5-minute increments is largely determined or totally determined by the market. So we say we're fuel agnostic. We don't pick the winners and losers. We don't pick coal over wind or wind over solar or solar over gas, so forth and so on. It's the market that does. And that ensures that consumers receive the lowest cost electricity that's available at the time. But so I say all that to answer your question. So Kansas generates a little over 50,000 megawatts of power. I should say gigawatts, about 50,000, and they only use about 40,000. So they're making more than they need for the state of Kansas. So we refer to that as a net exporter. So they're benefiting from the market, not only as a buyer, but as a seller. And in terms of the generation within our 14 state region that we get from Kansas, the leader in that is, and probably not surprising to you, is wind. Wind makes up 43.3% of the generation in the state of Kansas. In fact, in our 14 state region, only Oklahoma makes more power from wind than Kansas does. And that's oftentimes the SPP region, which we go from Louisiana to the Canadian border above the Dakotas. And if you look at a wind map of the United States, the most concentrated area for wind in the country is actually within our region. And so about 43% of the energy from Kansas that's within our market comes from wind. About 32% is coal. About 20% is nuclear. In fact, we get more nuclear energy through Wolf Creek there in Kansas than we get from any other nuclear power source. And gas makes up about 5%. Hydro is a fraction of a percent. Solar is a fraction of a percent. So that's kind of what the fuel mix looks like that's being contributed to the SPP market or bid into the SPP market and accepted from the state of Kansas. Now compare that to SPP as a whole. Looking at our 14 states, we're the only RTO in the United States that has wind as our number one fuel source. It surpassed coal last year, barely. Wind makes up 31.3% of the energy that was used within SPP in 2020. Coal was 30.9, so trailing by 0.4%. Gas was 26.6%, nuclear was 6.4, hydro was 4.5, and solar dropping below 1%. But there's a lot of future in solar,
like
which I think. I'm sorry.
The increase in wind, I'm interested in that. This is fairly recent, over the last 15 years or so, that wind has increased so much. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you look back to 2001, we had less than 100 megawatts of wind on the system. Fast forward to 2021, we have about 27,000 megawatts of wind. In fact, 3 days ago, all the energy that was needed in a given moment within the 14 state region, 3 days ago, 84% of the energy was coming from wind. Now that's one side of the coin. The other side is not only do we have to forecast how much energy is needed and make sure the generation is there to match the load, we're also having to get really good at forecasting the wind to know what's coming, because some of these larger coal and gas plants can take more than a day to get up and running at maximum capacity. And for example, we've seen days where, and we forecasted it correctly, thank goodness, but we have seen days where we've lost 16,000 megawatts of wind in 21 hours. Now, what does that mean? Basically, that means turning on 32 large coal or gas plants, and they can't just come on instantaneously. So you've got to forecast the wind days in advance and be ready for when you have the variability that you see in wind, for example.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. Now, Brett, Ashok, what would you like to add?
Just a quick thing. I mean, clearly that's a great explanation of where we are. Looking ahead, I mean, what we're going to see is this challenge, right? I mean, basically wind is there, but it's also not there at different times. So coal and gas are running a lot less, but they're still there, and we're paying for them to be there even when we're not using it. So the percentage of time that we use coal is reducing. So the question of really, this ties to the securitization issue, when do coal plants retire versus when do they just run less? And this is also going to be done balanced by solar is very low right now, but what you're going to see the utilities be doing is balance all that wind with a lot of new solar, because solar will be generating at different times. So that's also going to put pressure on the coal and gas and how much they're going to run. So the big thing that we're all looking to is storage. How does storage help us deal with this wind and solar and the fossil and nuclear generation, and what will things look like 5 to 10 years from now? So part of the Evergy planning process and the SPP planning process is all about forecasting based on everything that's happened in the last 15, 20 years. The next 10 years are going to be also quite challenging and different than they have been the last 10 years. And the key pieces are going to be the solar and the storage, and the transmission, which you'll hear about too from ITC, is really going to be key, because we have all this renewables which we could be taking even outside of SPP to other markets. So lots more we can talk about, but I just want to introduce us in this context that what we're looking ahead for the next 5 or 10 years is really more solar, more storage, more transmission as a way to address and I think of that as a huge opportunity for both Kansas and the SPP region, is because we have this huge low-cost clean resource that's going to be in huge demand by the rest of the country. And that's what the planning would let us do. How do we take advantage of this huge low-cost clean resource and make it available? So to me, solar, storage, and transmission are kind of the home run for us in the next 3, 5, 10 years.
Well, let's go to ITC now. And Brett, ITC Great Plains is in charge of the transmission lines that get the power all around the state. Do we have the capability to transition to cleaner energy away from fossil fuels right now?
Thanks, Sarah Jane. We've made a lot of progress in the state. You've heard some about that already from the prior speakers. But if you like renewable energy, you need to learn to love transmission, because transmission is the key. And you heard Mike say we're already a net exporter of energy in the state. We've got this tremendous energy resource in the western part of our state in particular. And Kansas's economy has always been driven by export of valuable projects or products. We send grain and beef by highway and rail. We move gas and oil through pipelines, and we need to move this valuable energy resource, this renewable energy resource, over a high voltage transmission system. So yes, new transmission is needed. We know that more than 30 of the largest utilities in the country have already made announcements that they expect to supply their customers with 80% of more of renewable energy in the very near future. We know that major companies that create a lot of jobs and a lot of economic activities, Google, Walmart, many others, are increasingly demanding 100% renewable energy or very high percentages of renewable energy. So we definitely need more transmission, but of course that's easier said than done. My company, which is unique in that we're an independent transmission company, we don't own any generation or any distribution. We just work with the Southwest Power Pool and the other utilities to try to plan and identify the right transmission at the right voltage to most efficiently serve customers. But you have to do that in a sensitive way with regard to impact on landowners, the environment, very complex regulatory processes, and very importantly, the ratepayers who ultimately pay for these large utility investments. The people who benefit need to pay for the transmission, and that's a complex set of issues that my company and many others work on every day.
Will you just explain briefly what it means to have more transmission? Does that mean more lines? What does it really mean for people? We need more transmission. What does that equate to?
We literally need more physical infrastructure. We need more lines at high voltage, more backbone transmission. We need more interconnections between the regions that Mike was talking about around the country. There are some technologies that can be deployed over time and tested to perhaps get some additional usage and efficiency out of the existing transmission, but those technologies aren't going to be enough. And as Ashok mentioned, another piece of this puzzle is what is the development of the storage technology. We don't have extremely high capacity commercial storage technology today, but it's better today than it was a year ago, and it's improving. So high capacity storage as well as new backbone transmission is part of the mix to get us to that renewable future.
I might just, if I could quickly add there to what Brett, to build on what Brett said. So one of our responsibilities at SPP is to plan for new transmission, and we've integrated so our board approves and issues these notices to construct for new transmission, and we have modernized the grid to the tune of about $10 billion in the last 10, 15 years. A lot of that, quite frankly, is to integrate the rapid growth in renewables. I'll never forget being in Nebraska, speaking to the legislature once, and there were people out front. They were protesting for the wind turbines and the wind farm, but they were also protesting against a new transmission line. Well, you've got to be able to get the power from where it's made to where it's needed. The cows out there at the wind farm didn't need the energy. It was the population centers that needed the energy. And so, it's important to understand if you want clean renewable energy, you got to have the transmission to be able to move it, as Ashok and Britt both have pointed out. And we're looking 10, 20, 30 years out. And to Ashok's point, I mean, it's difficult to know the future because the future is changing so rapidly, but we're required to look 10, 20, 30 years out, because as Brett Wills knows, it can take up to 8.5 years to get a new transmission line built. You can build generation in under 2 years. And so that's the challenge moving forward.
And I'm going to add one quick thing to that, which is on the transmission issue. The big conversation going on at the federal level is around both transmission planning, and especially transmission that goes across Southwest Power Pool to the other RTOs, but also the cost allocation issue. So there's a lot of planning and a lot of transmission projects that are in the queue that want to get built. The question of who pays for that transmission in terms of Kansas customers, utilities, people who are going to get the benefits of that cleaner, cheaper power, are the parts of the country. So the cost allocation issue on transmission is the key thing to watch in the next year or two as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission tries to deal with that issue. So both better planning, a lot of developers out there with a lot of good projects, and a better job with interconnection between different pools, and cost allocation. We'll keep coming back to that because I know Kansas customers think they're picking up a bigger share of those costs than they would like to. And some of those costs could be allocated in a different way. So that just looking at some of the policy details that will be important to address. And there will also potentially be some federal policies around tax credits for transmission and also for storage. Just like for wind and solar, production tax credit and the investment tax credit were key in driving down costs over the last 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, basically, wind and solar have come down 90% in cost over the last 10 years. Storage is same thing's going to happen with storage in the next 5 to 10 years too. And some of the federal policies are not going to be about some of the big issues we talk about in terms of energy. It's going to be around storage and transmission. And watching Congress on those two topics will tell you a lot about what will happen regionally in terms of energy issues.
It's a very complex picture, and this is really a useful conversation, I think. Brian, I want to come back to you. Do you think there are different sources of energy are superior or inferior, or is energy just energy? In other words, do you believe green energy could provide some other advantage beyond simply producing a smaller carbon footprint?
I mean, electrons are electrons. Whatever the electricity that's produced, no matter the source, it all provides. You can flip on the switch in your house, but then there are those other arguments. The carbon footprint, or the jobs related with it, or other impacts. I mean, there are these externalities, so to speak, about it. But it does. The reporter in me does kind of have these questions, that pop up, especially as I've been listening to people here talk about it. And this is really I mean, you said it, Sarah, this is really complicated. And as I talk to people and as I try to report on this and make it, to where regular people can understand it, I found that most people, they don't even know the SPP exists, or, they just assume that, well, my bill comes from Evergy. Evergy must be where I get my electricity from. And that's not always the case. And so I wonder if and sorry to steal your job, Sarah, and ask a question. I don't know who can answer this, but I wonder if the complexities of this, and I hear sometimes some of the anti on transmission or wind is, well, why do I want this here if it's just going to go, a Florida company's doing it, or it's just going to go to another state and not Kansas. I wonder if the complexities of this make it difficult to kind of move forward on some of these, projects we don't think of, these infrastructure projects, the transmission that we don't think about in the general public often. And I don't know who would be best to answer that, but, is that an issue? The fact that people don't even really understand that our electricity sometimes comes from North Dakota, or sometimes comes from Oklahoma, or sometimes it does come from Jeffrey Energy Center, in Kansas.
I'd be curious what Representative Schreiber would
Yeah.
think about that question.
Yeah,
Ashok, go ahead.
it's definitely an issue. And before I was a legislator, I spent 38 years at what's now Evergy, started out at Wolf Creek and so forth. But over the time, just getting people to understand where that energy came from, I had to go back into history and kind of educate myself and then educate, people I was talking to. But, back in the early 1900s, there were a lot of, each city had their own little electric power plant. And Emporia had one. It ran an electric trolley system here in the city. And Council Grove had a small power plant. Well, Council Grove being fairly small, their generator broke down and they didn't have the money to pay for it, the repairs. So they worked a deal out with Emporia to build a transmission line from Emporia to Council Grove. And not that that was the start of a transmission grid, but that's how the idea for distributed energy, distributing energy around through lines and so forth starts to make sense. And now I had a question right after the polar event back in February is why are we sending all our energy out of state? Why don't we just generate it ourselves and keep it right here in the state? And I had to explain, well, what happens when our plant goes down and we need to get power in here? We have to connect with other states to bring power in. And that idea of this interconnectedness, it's tough to explain, but because people just flip the switch and the lights come on and they think it came from Jeffrey or Wolf Creek or wherever.
Representative Schreiber, I think I might be taking this sideways a little bit, but I want to ask you about a different piece of legislation. There are now tougher criminal charges for trespassing onto pipeline infrastructure located in the eminent domain. Can you explain that legislation for us?
Yeah, so what this was, it's not just pipelines, it's critical infrastructure. It includes pipelines, it includes generating plants, it includes broadband facilities, all of these. And the purpose of it is because these have become so vital to our business, for residents, hospitals and so forth, that we need to make sure that those type of instances where people intentionally damage facilities, that there's a price to pay, a significant price to pay. And that was the purpose of it. And, I think where you might be going with this is, there was pushback from the tribes here in the state about, well, this is just a reaction to what was up in South Dakota when the XL pipeline came through there. And even though pipelines are included in this bill, it's much broader, and to hopefully address some of the fears that the Native Americans felt that this was just targeting them. There was also it's called a whereas clause that was added in the bill to say this is not meant to undermine anybody's ability to protest, construction of facilities or whatever. But when you interfere with the operation of a plant or say a broadband facility or something, then there are charges that can be made.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to some of the economics of energy in a second. And I'd like to hear from Ashok what an increase in wind turbines means for the economy of Kansas. But first, for a little context here, Kingman County in South Central Kansas has 3 large-scale wind farms, and officials there want the freedom to make their own rules when it comes to where turbines should go, because County Commissioner Jack Timish says wind projects stirred up business and government revenues. Let's hear that clip.
Leave our local control alone. We can work with our people. yeah, we're not going to make everybody happy and somebody's going to be mad. But as of right now, we're moving forward with more wind farms. I can tell you that with the money that they received off it, they built a new $5 million jail. They refaced an expo center in the city there that everybody rents, welcome to use. We are going to put in 5 new bridges that have needed work. Without the revenue from this wind farm, we would not be doing any of this.
So Ashok, what does an increase in turbine farms mean for Kansas' economic future?
I mean, the short answer is, for the state's economy, we have to go and look at what our assets are and what our competitive advantage is. There's no doubt in my mind that wind and its track record over the last 10, 15, 20 years has proven its economic value to the state. So this train has left the station. We're heading in that direction. We're going to be doing a lot more renewables and wind. The key is to complement it. We need to have a portfolio approach. So even for wind to have the value that it has, we're going to need to complement it, as we've discussed earlier, with a lot of solar, because solar generates electricity at different times of the day than wind does. So from a managing the risk and the reliability issues, Kansas economy needs to look at all of these different pieces and say, what's our competitive advantage? How can we grow our economy? How can we meet our needs and meet the needs of the region and the country? And I think, as one of our earlier speakers said, whether it's grain or other commodities, we have a resource that drives our economy, and renewable energy happens to be it. And I think with transmission, with storage, and eventually even with hydrogen, which I think we could really take a lead on in Kansas, we have the assets, we have the workforce, we have the universities. So we should be thinking about our economy. As an economist, you look at all of the inputs. We have those inputs. We just have to get organized and coordinated to see how everybody benefits from taking advantage of these great resources and growing the economy. Now, keeping young people here, creating the jobs of the future. So to me, the wind, there are always going to be issues around siting and this challenge and that challenge, but that to me is kind of, momentary. I think transmission, yes, some people oppose it, but we have built a lot of transmission and a lot more. The ones that get opposed get a lot of attention. The ones that don't and get built don't get the attention. So my view is a lot of wind has gotten built. There was wind opposition, there is transmission. So I expect this process to continue. I would just like Kansas to even take it up one more notch, because we're competing with other states and competing globally. We should be looking at the supply chains with all of these solutions too. I mean, electric vehicles, where will all the component parts be made? Wind, transmission, solar, we can actually attract the supply chain jobs associated with clean technologies too. So I'm taking your question of economics to a much bigger, broader level, which I think of really the energy economy is going to be the backbone for what we do for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And the sooner we can get our act together and compete even more aggressively, the sooner we will get all the benefits.
I want to get to a couple of audience questions in a moment, but first I want to come back to you, Mike. You had talked about how the Southwest Power Pool kind of manages the different types of energy. And what I'm curious about is, what are the different needs for those different types of energy, or are there? Does it end up being kind of all translated into the same thing, or do they have different needs?
Well, so as I indicated earlier, we don't own the transmission, we don't own the generation, but it's our job to, through our wholesale electric market, to facilitate and determine which generators run when. And so it's actually our member companies, and where appropriate, with the approval of their state regulatory commissions, they determine what type of generation they're going to build. We don't. Now, we'll say that we do have a requirement. Any new generation that's going to be built, we're required to do a generator interconnection study to determine how that new generation would reliably connect to the bulk electric system, the high voltage electric grid that we manage across all our part of 14 states, including the state of Kansas. So we kind of get a look in the crystal ball of what's coming in terms of what the future looks like. I don't have a breakout for Kansas. I've got a breakout for the 14 state region, but and not all the potential new generation that we're asked to study actually ends up getting built, but quite a bit does. And so when you look at what does the future hold, in our region, 42% of new energy is going to be solar. About 39% is going to be wind. About 6% is gas, and about 13% is storage. In fact, under study now is over 11,000 megawatts of storage, and I can tell you that just a couple of years ago, it didn't even show up at all. Ironically, when FERC came out with Order 841 about integrating storage, if you will, into the markets, ironically, we had 841 megawatts, and that was just a couple of years ago. And now we have, 11, over 11,000, over 35,000 of solar, over 33,000, 32,000 of wind, and about 5,000 of gas. So, in terms of, and I think it was said earlier, it really doesn't matter what, to some degree, it really doesn't matter what the state or federal policy is. It's the public, it's industry that's already driving this. Whether there's limits set or not, that's the direction that we're headed for the future. Now, I will say this, that no other RTO has been able to hit 85% penetration on wind, serving 18 million people across 14 states with 85% of the energy coming from wind, 84%. We've been able to do that because we have about 150 of these quick start, fast start natural gas generators in our back pocket that help us manage the variability of wind. As I mentioned earlier, the larger coal, the larger gas plants can take more than a day to get up and running. These 5 to 200 megawatt fast start, quick start natural gas generators, they can go from off to full blast in under 10 minutes. And if we didn't have those in our back pocket, there's no way we'd be setting these North American wind records. And so I think it's important for people to understand, I guess what the point I'm trying to make is you need to have a diverse energy portfolio, and that's really what we have in SPP.
Then I definitely want to come to Brett next with the question of the different types of energy, if they have different needs. And then also, Brett, are there adequate regulations in place to keep up with this shift away from fossil fuels?
Well, the entire electric industry is regulated by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And so there's some extremely stringent regulation to make sure that generation from all sources is reliably interconnected. Studies are performed, as Mike represented, and it's very, very serious regulatory oversight with significant fines if you don't comply with those regulations. So I think the regulatory infrastructure is more than adequate with regard to where we're headed with this transition. There's a variety of regulatory issues from FERC we probably don't have time to talk about today that my company and others would like to see some reform in the Order 1000 process and in regional and interregional planning. And there's a lot of work going on in those areas today. We talked about Kansas being an energy exporter and moving that extremely high capacity renewable energy from Western Kansas to bigger population centers, not only in Kansas, not only in SPP, but into other regions. In order to do that, you need more effective cooperation, collaboration between regions to build high voltage transmission between the regions to take the power to the companies and to the customers that would like to consume that power. And my company, working with others in the region and with the Southwest Power Pool, is working on those sorts of issues. Sorry,
Who
Jane.
do we sell our excess energy to the most? Does it go to one state in particular or a different region in particular?
I don't know that, and I suspect that it can be variable based upon the dynamics in the market on any given day, where the demands are, weather patterns, and the particular availability. So it's a very dynamic and changing market as far as where that energy is going on any particular day, or for that matter, any particular minute.
Well, let's get to a few audience questions. I'm just going to throw some of these out here, and then whoever wants to jump in, feel free. Kim, in an email, asks, what is the one thing we can do to make Kansas #1 in renewable energy? I feel like Ashok will want to weigh in on that.
I think storage is a huge part of it. I mean, I really do think, because of the variability, I'm not going to undermine transmission. I think transmission is huge, but so it's really storage and transmission go together here in terms of dealing with both the wind and solar's variability. So
I think that's something people wouldn't expect. I think for the most part, that what's important are these other pieces, these other technologies that are involved in getting energy from one place to another. It's not build more wind turbines, it's transmission and storage.
More wind will be built if we could figure out ways to use it and sell it, right? So that part we know how to do. The question is really, where does that go? And can either store it for times when we don't, when we need it, and that still presents, those are challenges. But one thing I also wanted to quickly mention, since we're also going to run out of time, is we haven't spent any time really on, of course, the demand side and the energy efficiency and the buildings. And if we waste 20, 30, 40% of our electricity and energy in how we use it, we're also not being very smart in terms of how, when we get more electric vehicles, we're not going to double the size of the electric grid or double the size of all our generation. We need to figure out how we use electricity in smart ways, in new ways, but also not waste a lot of electricity. So as an environmentalist and as an energy efficiency advocate, I wanted to make sure in this conversation, the demand side of the equation and flexible demand as issues are very important, as we learned from this winter event. You can have huge spikes in demand, and the system has to respond to huge spikes in winter and summer, and consumers pay very high bills then, and they're very unhappy. And so unless we're looking at shaping the demand curve at the same time that we're dealing with these other issues, so to me, when you ask what's the most important, shaping demand is as important as the supply side issues we're talking about.
So Ashok, what would you say to people, like, what is the number one thing, number one habit that they should have? Is it turn off the light when you leave the room, or is it something else? What would help the most?
I mean, it's not about individual behavior. I mean, that matters, but it really is about the type of buildings we build. So basically, if you build a very leaky building, half of the energy is just going out. So it's really, we need to solve some structural, so to speak, fundamental problems of how builders build and how owners shape their building. So appliances have gotten better, lighting has gotten better. Yes, people should turn their lights off. And yes, people should turn their thermostat down. But the biggest changes we need to make is to the building envelope. And so this is another conversation to have on another day. But how we build our buildings is a really important part of why we have these huge peaks, along with weather events. It's the fact that our buildings are really poorly built and designed.
Yeah,
So
and not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but this brings up other major equity issues that we didn't talk about, which is there are energy efficiency programs out there. There are states that want to push these energy efficiency programs, but a lot of them don't necessarily work for lower income people. What do you do about someone who's a renter who doesn't have the power to make upgrades to the building that they live in, or et cetera? Or how do you reach those multifamily units with these energy efficiency programs? And that's a big challenge as well.
We
Which
have
means you have to go at owners, not just, I mean, so you have to figure out what the building owners' motivations are and how to incentivize that. And like I said, we could spend a whole hour on efficiency in buildings, and I'd love to do that.
We are rapidly running out of time. I have a whole slew of additional questions for you that I have not gotten to yet, and several more audience questions. So let me see if I can just grab a couple here. I want to get this question answered from Larry, who sent us an email. He says, just a few days ago, there was a cyber attack which shut down the Colonial pipeline that carries fuel to the East Coast. Is there a similar danger for our electrical grid? And if so, what precautions should we take? Who can answer Larry's question?
Let me jump in there and say that the answer is yes. We think one of the top corporate risks in our industry is a cyber security, a cyber attack. But I would point out that unlike the gas pipeline, the most heavily regulated of all of America's critical infrastructure is electricity. We're regulated by NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we're audited by them as not only TOs or regional transmission organizations, but individual utilities. And I can tell you that we're all collectively subject to fines of more than $1.3 million per day per violation. Mm-hmm. And so I can tell you that the electric industry puts a lot of resources, a lot of staff, a lot of technical ability into trying to mitigate this risk, but it's real. And there are people every day trying to disrupt the electric grid in the United States.
Yeah. I want to stay with you real quickly here, Mike, with another question. Do you think it's possible for an energy disaster like the one that happened in Texas earlier in the year to occur in Kansas?
Well, we hope not. You know, we had some challenges back in February too within mm-hmm. Southwest Fire Pool. We had what's referred to as a temporary controlled interruption of service to avoid cascading blackouts, and we had the perfect storm. It was the coldest temperatures. You know, one of the benefits of our region is it's not uncommon to be 78 degrees in Shreveport, Louisiana, and minus 20 in Bismarck, North Dakota, and that actually helps the entire system. The entire region was below 0 degrees for more than a day, and we had the perfect storm. We had wind turbines that iced up. We had a shortage of natural gas. I know, talking with the Secretary of Energy in Oklahoma, not the entire state, just one gas producer in Oklahoma had 800 gas wells and only 38 were operable. They couldn't get the gas out of the ground because it was frozen at the wellhead. And then even coal, the coal piles were frozen and they couldn't get the coal from the coal pile into the generator. And so it created some challenges for us. Nothing like we saw in Texas, obviously, but it was the first time that we'd experienced that in 80 years. And it was really the perfect storm, which I think demonstrates you need diversified energy fuel sources. But even then, in a very rare event like we saw that no one has seen the likes of since the 1890s, it can happen. But because we're part of a regional network, a regional grid, we were able to help one another, and we were also able to import energy. There's Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and then there's Texas. And being part of the Eastern, we were able to import some energy from the West, as well as our neighbors in the East, to mitigate and to soften the blow. But yeah, I mean, whether it's a cyber attack or a weather event, I mean, it could happen. But I mean, the reality is, more than likely, you're going to be out of power due to localized distribution line issues caused by a tornado, icing, so forth, and so on. But it can happen, yes.
So we are at 6 o'clock now. Brian, I want to come to you last here with just what piece of this puzzle, I mean, this is a much larger puzzle, many more pieces in this puzzle than I think a lot of people give you credit for. What piece do you think we're still needing here to discuss tonight? Before
Well, I
we
mean,
have a part two, we're going to need a part two of this conversation.
Oh man, you could do part infinity.
Yeah.
In doing my reporting, I've spoken to many of the people on our panel before, and it's hard sometimes because I'm doing a small little spot story and we end up talking for 45 minutes because it's just so fascinating. But that is kind of the bigger issue too. It is really complicated and it's complex, and you have a lot of competing interests. Whether that's from the customer interest, whether that's from the utilities interest, whether that's from an environmental perspective. I mean, there's just so much happening here. That there isn't one thing, and unfortunately, and maybe so that's like a negative, but it's also a positive because there are so many opportunities here for people to get involved, for companies to get involved, for states to get involved, to really figure out what role can we play and how can we help out here, whether that is figuring out electrification and electric vehicles and the infrastructure for that, whether that's figuring out storage, whether that's helping people understand the needs for transmission and how that even works. Like I said, when I talk to, regular people who aren't, energy policy nerds, that a lot of, I didn't even know that the SPP existed before I moved to Kansas and started looking into it. I was in a different state. Isn't a part of one of these regional organizations. That was new to me. And so just kind of helping people understand the bigger scheme is important. And then, like Ashok brought up, there's the energy, there's the demand side of it, energy efficiency and social justice and equity issues. So I wish I could tell you there was one thing that we can take from this and run with it and feel good about ourselves, but there are many things. And so I guess I would say pick what you're interested in and you could probably make a difference or learn more and kind of improve your understanding of how we're all wrapped into this big electric grid.
Well, thank you all for such a great discussion. I hope all of you enjoyed it. You can watch this conversation on our website under the events tab at kmuw.org. This Digital Democracy on Tap conversation is sponsored by Susan and Leon Mader of Mader and Associates. For KMUW, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo.